A child is always the breath, the heartbeat of their parents. For Hollywood stars, the love they have for their children burns even more fiercely and sacredly than any spotlight on stage. That is why when a child is born imperfect or has to struggle against illness, the pain tears their souls apart. Some are willing to give up a flourishing career at its peak just to spend every day and night by their child's hospital bed. Some, with trembling hands, sign the surgery consent form knowing that it could be the last chance for survival, or perhaps the final farewell that will never be undone. And there are also those who, for the rest of their lives, will never again hear the beloved words "dad" or "mom" from their own flesh and blood. So prepare yourself with a tissue because the stories ahead will surely bring tears to your eyes. And now, let us begin. 1. John Travolta. A seizure took away his 16-year-old son. John Travolta, a name engraved in the memory of millions of film lovers through his mesmerizing dance moves in Saturday Night Fever, his charming persona in Grease, and his glorious comeback in Pulp Fiction. On screen, he was the embodiment of allure and triumph. Yet behind the dazzling spotlight, there lies a chapter of his life that whenever touched upon makes his heart ache as if a wound had just been torn open. In 1992, in Los Angeles, Jet Travolta let out his first cry. It was the moment John and his wife, actress Kelly Preston, had long yearned for. In an appearance on Good Morning America, John once shared that the instant he wrapped his arms around his newborn son, he knew without doubt that from then on, his life would revolve around a single mission to protect his boy from all harm. But fate soon cast its shadow over Jet's early years. At just 2 years old at Cedars-Sinai Hospital, doctors diagnosed him with Kawasaki disease, a rare illness that can directly attack the heart and other vital organs. Over time, signs of autism emerged accompanied by violent seizures that kept the entire family living in constant fear. Their home in Ocala, Florida was transformed by John and Kelly into a comprehensive therapy haven, a physical therapy room, a play area designed with absolute safety, and a team of nurses on duty around the clock. On the Oprah Winfrey Show, Kelly once choked up as she confessed that just seeing Jet laugh was enough to make all her fear and exhaustion disappear. Amid the stressful days, there were still interwoven moments of peace, Jet driving a golf cart with his father under the golden afternoon sun, sitting for hours with his mother coloring a picture, or the whole family enjoying the sea breeze together on the beaches of the Bahamas. But such peace was as fragile as morning mist. On the morning of January 2nd, 2009, while the family was vacationing at Old Bahama Bay, the sky was clear, the sea breeze gentle, and the first rays of sunlight glowed bright. Jet said he wanted to go to the bathroom. Just minutes later, a heavy, piercing, chilling sound rang out. John and the hotel staff rushed in only to be met with a scene that ripped the breath from his chest. Jet lay motionless on the tiled floor, his head having struck the bathtub. This seizure was too fierce, sweeping his son away like a storm impossible to resist. Kelly collapsed to her knees, her cries shattering the air. John clutched his son's body, growing colder by the second, pressed him tightly to his chest, and shook him in desperation. "Jet, can you hear me? Open your eyes. Please." But everything dissolved into merciless silence. Jet was taken to Rand Memorial Hospital, but the doctor's words extinguished all hope. 16 years of life ended in what seemed to be just an ordinary morning. The news spread widely across CNN People, ABC News, yet no headline could capture the true depth of that grief. It took many months before John and Kelly dared to return to the public eye. In a conversation with Barbara Walters, his tears flowed endlessly, his voice breaking as he admitted that ever since Jet's departure, a part of his soul had vanished. He said he would trade every role, every award, just to hold his son once more. That emptiness remained etched deep in his heart, a reminder to the world that no matter how high one may stand in fame, the loss of a child is the greatest tragedy a human being can endure. And John Travolta is not the only one who carries such a wound. Another Hollywood legend, Sylvester Stallone, also had to bow before a cruel reality when his son was diagnosed with severe autism, forcing him to set aside the limelight to stand by his child on a grueling journey. To Sylvester Stallone, when the invincible hero had to kneel before his child's illness. In 1979, Los Angeles glowed under the lights of glory. Rocky had just catapulted Sylvester Stallone to the pinnacle of Hollywood, with the press hailing him as the new icon of the era. Yet, among all the cheers, the moment that made Stallone's heart swell with pride did not unfold on screen. It was the moment he walked out of Cedars-Sinai Hospital, holding in his arms his newborn son, Sergio. His face then radiated like that of a fighter who had just won the greatest victory of his life, the victory of a father feeling the warmth of his own flesh and blood for the first time. In those early years, Sergio's life was filled with the boundless love of his parents. His hair soft as silk, his deep eyes mirroring his father's, his rare but gentle smile as warm as the morning sun. Stallone often told friends that just opening the door and seeing his son gazing at him made all the stress and fatigue of the film set melt away as if they had never existed. But cracks began to appear in this picture of happiness. Sergio responded little when called by name, often withdrew into a corner, patiently lined up his toys, and avoided sudden embraces. At first, his wife Sasha Chak thought their son was simply quiet. But after countless afternoons spent calling his name dozens of times and receiving only heavy silence, fear slowly crept into their hearts. In 1982, at UCLA Medical Center, the diagnosis was delivered in a room thick with dread congenital autism severe. The sound of a pen scratching on paper echoed chillingly in the silence. Stallone bowed his head, his eyes fixed on his shoes, as though the entire world had just collapsed before him. Years later, in an interview with People, he admitted, "I've filmed hundreds of scenes of being knocked down, but nothing ever hurt as much as that moment." From that instant, the Rambo of the big screen entered a battle with no visible opponent, no applause. He scaled back his filming schedule, devoting all his time, energy, and finances to his son's treatment. Every language exercise, every hour of physical therapy, every method, even unproven ones, he grasped as though each fragile chance were the only lifeline. The smallest signs of progress from Sergio became treasures beyond price. Once, after months of silence, the boy suddenly uttered "Dad," and Stallone broke down in tears right in the therapy room, oblivious to everyone's gaze. A gentle touch from his son's hand was enough for him to carry in memory for a lifetime. Yet interlaced with these moments were hidden daggers of pain. More than once, he stood at a distance, watching his son gaze sadly at other children, playing his chest tightening with helplessness. Friends recalled how Stallone once left the treatment center with slumped shoulders, his head bowed as though carrying a whole dark sky. But the moment he passed a crowd of reporters, he immediately smiled brightly, as if just coming out of a triumphant press conference. Sasha once whispered that Stallone buried his sorrow deep within, because he knew that if he ever let it out, he would never be able to control it again. More than 40 years have passed, and Sergio still lives with his family, needing special care every day. That battle has never seen an ending, and Stallone has never abandoned the front line. His love is not loud, not written into a script, not accompanied by heroic music, but it is steadfast, enduring, and stronger than any heroic role he ever played on screen. Elsewhere, another legendary star, Elizabeth Taylor, also once spent endless nights sitting by her child's sickbed, wishing she could take on every ounce of pain herself. 3-point Elizabeth Taylor. I would trade every award, every role, as long as it could take away your pain. In 1961, while the entire world was still captivated by the beauty of Cleopatra and those legendary violet eyes, Elizabeth Taylor suddenly shook the European press. The reason was neither a new role nor a scandalous love affair, but the sight of her appearing at an orphanage in Munich, Germany, cradling in her arms a tiny baby girl wrapped in a cream-colored blanket. That baby's name was Maria Burton, only a few months old at the time. From the very first moment, the doctors placed a cold, harsh diagnosis on Elizabeth's shoulders. Maria was born with a dislocated hip. Without early and continuous surgery, those small legs would never function normally and could even be condemned to a lifetime of disability. Eddie Fisher, Elizabeth's husband at the time, was briefly stunned, but she only held the baby tighter, letting her gaze sink deeply into the child's eyes as though making a silent promise. Later, she recalled in Life magazine, "At that moment, I wasn't thinking about illness. I only saw a pair of desperate eyes searching for the safety of an embrace, and I knew I had to become that embrace." On the day she brought Maria home to Los Angeles, Elizabeth did not close her eyes once throughout the long flight. Every faint whimper from the baby made her bend down to kiss her forehead, whispering lullabies broken by sobs. Passengers on that flight never forgot the image of a movie star holding her daughter close to her chest, as if letting go for even a second would make her entire world collapse. But Elizabeth's journey of motherhood was not paved with roses. From the moment Maria began to walk, hip pain attacked, causing the little girl to collapse on the floor again and again. Doctors at Cedars-Sinai advised multiple rounds of surgery. Once, while filming Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Elizabeth suddenly received news that Maria needed an urgent operation. She immediately abandoned the shoot, still wearing her character's costume, rushing straight to the car, her mind consumed by a single burning thought: "I must get to my daughter right now." The press often saw Elizabeth leaving film sets bathed in the glow of fame, but few ever witnessed her sitting for hours on a cold plastic chair outside the operating room, her hands clenched until they turned white, her eyes fixed on the harsh red sign that read, "Operation in Progress." On another occasion, after a surgery lasting more than 4 hours, Elizabeth walked into the recovery room. Maria lay motionless, her pale face covered in tubes and IV lines. Elizabeth gently lifted her daughter's tiny hand to her cheek, and with a trembling voice that spilled out like a vow, she whispered, "If I had to trade every award, every role, even my career, I would, as long as you are free of pain, my Maria." In the years that followed, Maria slowly learned to walk again, each step unsteady, her gait still limping. But as long as Elizabeth saw her daughter smile while passing through the garden in front of their home, she knew she had won the most important Oscar of her life. For Robert Redford, 2 short months to hold his child in his arms. Before the world hailed Robert Redford as a Hollywood legend, he was simply a 23-year-old newlywed, living with his wife Lola Van Wagenen in a small New York apartment. They didn't have much money, but they had love and the eager anticipation of their first child, the brightest hope of a future just unfolding. On summer evenings in 1959, Robert would sit by the window, painstakingly building a wooden cradle for his baby. He painted it white, carefully smoothing every edge and corner, afraid that those tiny hands might get scratched. Each time he walked past, he paused, imagining a little boy lying peacefully inside, stirring softly in sleep as the morning sun filtered through the window to kiss his still red cheeks. By September, Scott Anthony Redford let out his first cry. Robert remembered vividly the moment his son's tiny hand clutched his finger, a weak grip, but strong enough to make his whole body tremble. In that instant, he silently vowed, "I will always protect you, no matter what happens." But fate chose a cruel way to test that vow. Just a few weeks later, Scott began showing strange symptoms. He cried in short bursts, his breathing turned rapid, and he kept his eyes tightly shut for hours, as though shutting out both the light and the world itself. Doctors said it might just be a cold, but Lola felt a chilling unease clawing at her heart. On November 17th, New York was gripped by a bitter cold. Robert was at an audition when the phone rang. On the other end, Lola's voice broke apart into fragments of anguish. "Robert, the baby, he's not breathing. They're trying." He never remembered how he left the set, only that when he reached the hospital, the emergency room reeked of antiseptic, and the white lights stung his eyes. The doctor walked out and shook his head, a slow, heavy shake that slammed the door shut on an entire world. Scott was gone. The cause, sudden infant death syndrome, an invisible enemy against which medicine at the time was nearly powerless. Robert lifted his son, the tiny body already cold. He pressed his cheek against the baby's as though trying to pass his warmth, his breath, to cling to even the faintest flicker of life. But it was far too late. 2 months. That was the entirety of Scott's time on Earth. 2 months too short for a child to ever know his father's voice, but long enough to turn a young man into a father, only to rip away the most precious thing from his arms. Years later, when Robert had reached the very summit of Hollywood, he still mentioned Scott's name in interviews. In The Guardian, he once said, "There are losses that time never heals. You only learn to live with them, like a part of your body that's been lost, but still aches forever." Outwardly, Robert Redford became the face of strength of indomitable roles. But deep within, he remained the father who once sat for hours in a dark room holding the small blanket still scented with his son's milk, silent until the dawn blurred in his tear-filled eyes. 5. Gene Tierney, the pain and torment of a mother. In the 1940s, all of Hollywood revered Gene Tierney as a goddess of the silver screen with eyes as deep as an autumn lake, a delicate face so flawless that even the hands of time seemed hesitant to touch, and a gentle smile powerful enough to break down every wall of defense in the human heart. Yet behind that dazzling halo lay a lingering wound that she herself once admitted, "It is a life sentence, and I will never be pardoned." In 1943, when her career was at its peak, Jean had just married the talented fashion designer Oleg Cassini. Her happiness became even more complete when she learned she was pregnant with her first child. She still eagerly accepted invitations to appear at events, signing autographs to support soldiers during World War II, believing she was doing the right thing, that every handshake and every smile she gave would bring a little comfort to those far from home. One evening at the Hollywood Canteen, a long line of fans was waiting for her autograph. Among them was a young girl with a radiant smile, though her eyes carried a hint of unease. When it was her turn, she suddenly embraced Jean, almost boasting with innocent candor. "I escaped from a German measles quarantine camp just to meet you." Jean simply smiled and hugged her back, unaware that in that very moment, a seed of illness had been planted in her body that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A few weeks later, she developed a fever and a rash, classic symptoms of rubella. Doctors warned of a high risk for the fetus, though they still left a fragile thread of hope. Jean cradled her belly and whispered to her unborn child, "We will get through this together, my love." On October 15, 1943, the frail cry of a baby girl, Daria Cassini, was heard. But just hours later, a doctor entered the room, his eyes heavy with sorrow, delivering a diagnosis that cut like a blade. Daria was born profoundly deaf, partially blind, and with severe intellectual disabilities. In her memoir, Jean wrote, "I listened and could barely breathe. Everything around me faded. It felt as though my own hands had locked the door to my child's life. From that moment on, each day became a battle within herself. She remembered every detail of that fateful night. The dim yellow lights, the sound of music drifting from the dance hall, the young girl's face, the embrace, and the words that had unintentionally become a life sentence for her child. Through endless sleepless nights, she tormented herself. If only I had taken a step back that day. If only I had refused. My child could have seen the sky, could have heard the birds sing. Daria grew up accompanied by her mother's tireless efforts journeys from the best doctors in New York to specialized care centers in California, yet miracles never came. Eventually, Jean had to make the most heartbreaking decision of her life to place her daughter in long-term care. She called it the second knife of her existence. Each visit, she would hold Daria tightly for as long as she could, telling her stories about the deep blue of the ocean, the scent of jasmine drifting through the night, or the fiery sunsets over the Beverly Hills. Daria could not hear and could not fully see, yet Jean kept talking, kept holding her as though with her love alone she could restore the skies that fate had stolen away. She once admitted with anguish, "I made millions smile, yet I was powerless before the smile of my own child." The story of Jean Tierney became one of Hollywood's most heartbreaking tragedies, proof that sometimes just a seemingly harmless moment can shatter an entire future, and that a mother's pain once carved deep will never fade away. 6. Angie Dickinson, when a daughter took her own life from too much pain. On January 4th, 2007, Los Angeles lay under a freezing fog. At 2 a.m., the phone rang, ripping through the silence. Just 3 words uttered in a hoarse voice on the other end of the line were enough for Angie Dickinson to know her entire world had just collapsed. Her only daughter, Nikki Bacharach, would never return again. Not because of an accident nor a fatal illness, but because the storms within her soul had swept her away after 40 years of struggling to survive in a world too harsh for such a fragile spirit. In the stillness of her home, Angie sat motionless in front of a wall covered with photographs. The dim yellow light shone over the image of a little blonde girl clutching a doll, her eyes half closed in the sun, her smile not yet fully formed. Angie whispered, her voice breaking apart. "Why? Did you have to leave me like this?" Memories pulled her back to 1966. When Nikki was just a few months old, Angie had sensed her daughter was different from other children. The baby rarely smiled when held, her eyes often drifting far away, as if lost in a private world no one else could enter. The doctor's diagnosis merely confirmed what a mother's heart already knew. Nikki had Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder combined with weak eyesight. At that time, Asperger's was still a vague concept. Beyond the medical difficulties, Nikki also faced suspicion and exclusion from society. At the peak of her career, Angie willingly set aside major roles to stay close to her daughter. She patiently taught Nikki the smallest things, from tying shoelaces, recognizing colors, to forming complete sentences. Each night, she would read the same thin book over and over again, hoping that every word, every sentence would become a fragile thread pulling her child closer to the outside world. But 40 years passed, and even as an adult, Nikki still lived within a closed circle with few friends and constant battles with depression. Burt Bacharach. Nikki's father once admitted on television she was intelligent, but the world was too loud and cruel for her. As for Angie, she carried her daughter from one clinic to another, from specialist to specialist, trying every therapy ever suggested, but each glimmer of hope would quickly vanish. And then, that winter morning took everything away. When the news came that Nikki was gone, Angie felt as if the sky itself had collapsed, leaving nothing to cling to. Speaking to the press, she uttered only a short sentence, but one that contained an entire lifetime of heartbreak. "My daughter never lacked love. She only lacked a world gentle enough for her to live in." From that moment on, her eyes always carried a cold emptiness that time could never fill. Nikki had taken with her a part of her mother's heart forever, the part that still aches every single day, knowing that even boundless love can sometimes be powerless against the cruelty of life. Angie knew she was not the only one in Hollywood to endure such loss. Decades earlier, another famous parent, Roy Rogers America's singing cowboy, had also cradled his little daughter in his arms, but only for 2 short months before fate cruelly took her away. 7. Roy Rogers, the father who helplessly watched his daughter pass away at only 2 years old. Mention Roy Rogers and the older generations of Americans will instantly recall the image of the singing cowboy riding his horse Trigger across the Wild West, his cheerful songs carried by the prairie winds into countless theaters. Yet behind the golden dust of the film sets and the melodies that once captivated millions of hearts lay a cruel truth. Roy had endured a loss so profound that even time itself could never heal it. In 1950, Roy and his wife, singer Dale Evans, adopted a tiny baby girl and named her Robin Elizabeth Rogers. The moment they brought Robin home, they called her a miracle from God. But that miracle carried with it a sharp wound in their hearts. Robin was diagnosed with Down syndrome, a condition shrouded at the time by stigma and social rejection. For Roy and Dale, however, the diagnosis was never a reason to love their daughter any less. On the contrary, they proudly held Robin on stage, included her in family photos, and ignored the cruel whispers that they should hide her to protect their reputation. In her memoir, Dale wrote, "We knew her life would be short, so every day with her had to be filled with love." Robin had eyes that sparkled like an autumn sky and a smile bright enough to light up an entire room, even on its darkest days. Each morning, Roy would hold her tightly and tell her about the places he had traveled, the endless horseback rides through meadows and distant mountains. He knew she was too little to understand, yet he still hoped those stories would somehow reach her tiny heart. But fate struck a merciless blow. Just as Robin turned 2, a severe bout of pneumonia hit without warning. Her breathing grew heavy, her bright eyes dimmed, and then, within the helpless embrace of her parents, the little girl drew her final breath. On the day of her burial, Roy stood frozen like stone, his hand clutching his familiar cowboy hat. Before him lay a tiny coffin covered in white flowers, so small it could be held within one's arms. He did not sing, he did not speak, he could not. Only silent tears rolled down the face of the man who had once brought smiles to millions of Americans. Each drop fell like the final note of a sorrowful ballad that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. After the tragedy, Dale wrote Angel Unaware, a book recounting Robin's story as that of a little angel sent by God to teach humanity about love and compassion. The work became a source of comfort for thousands of families raising children with disabilities, but for Roy, it remained forever the diary of a heart that had been shattered. 8. Shaquille O'Neal. The Giant's heart shattered outside his son's operating room. The name Shaquille O'Neal is inseparable from thunderous slam dunks that shook arenas from his towering height of 7'1", 2'16", and his body built like a fortress. On the court, he was every opponent's nightmare. Off the court, he was the gentle giant who could always make people laugh. Yet, at the end of 2018, that familiar smile suddenly vanished, replaced by sleepless nights and a quiet fear that seeped into his every breath. Shareef O'Neal, Shaq's son, then just 18 years old, and considered one of the brightest young talents in college. Basketball began showing troubling symptoms, crippling fatigue, labored breathing, and irregular heartbeats. A rushed series of tests delivered a chilling verdict: a congenital heart defect. Doctors warned that without immediate open-heart surgery, his life would be in danger. Shaq, the man who had never flinched before tens of thousands of fans who had faced down the strongest giants of the NBA, suddenly felt smaller than ever. He recalled on ESPN, "When I heard the doctor, it felt like someone had put an entire building on my chest. My legs couldn't hold me up." On the day of the surgery, Shareef lay on the hospital bed, his face pale, his frail body swallowed up by the green surgical gown. Shaq stood out in the hallway, his massive hand covering his face, his shoulders shaking with stifled sobs. He was powerless to shield his son from the surgeon's knife, from the razor-thin line between life and death, and that helplessness shattered the unshakable confidence he had carried all his life. The ticking of the clock in the waiting room dragged on longer than any game he had ever played, until finally the operating room doors swung open and the doctor stepped out with a faint smile announcing the surgery was a success. Shaq couldn't speak. He simply rushed to embrace his son as Sharif opened his eyes, his trembling hand gently brushing the long scar down his chest, the scar of life. Nearly a year later, Sharif returned to the basketball court. The scar still remained, but beneath it was a heart that had been saved, and beside him was a father who had once believed he could never break now, understanding that love was the truest strength of all. Shaquille O'Neal's fear of almost losing his son brought to mind another father, Arthur Miller, the great American playwright whose fate was even harsher, as his son, born with Down syndrome, spent his entire life in an institution completely separated from the arms of his family. 9 Arthur Miller, the wound he carried to his final breath. Arthur Miller, the great master of American theater, author of Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. The man who once moved millions with words that laid bare the torment of the human condition. Yet there was one role he never wanted to play under the spotlight, that of a father carrying a secret no stage light could ever illuminate. In 1966, during his marriage to photographer Inge Marath, Daniel Miller, his second son, was born. Right there in the delivery room, the doctor delivered a cold verdict: Down syndrome. At that time, the cruel recommendation was given with unsettling calm, as if it were a mere formality. Send him to an institution, it will be better for everyone. In the midst of the infant's weak cries and Inge's desolate gaze, Miller was forced to sign a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, sending his son to a residential facility for disabled children in Connecticut. From that moment on, Daniel's childhood unfolded within unfamiliar walls, cut off entirely from the embrace of his family. To the public, it was as if the boy had never existed. In interviews, Miller could speak of politics, of art, of romances that had once drawn headlines, but not once did he mention his second son. Outsiders thought he had forgotten, but in truth, it was a silent pain, solid and unyielding like stone, impossible to break. Those close to him recounted that Miller still quietly visited his son. He would bring along photo books, carefully wrapped wooden toys. Sitting by Daniel's bed, he would whisper stories about faraway lands, about the winter sea, about winds sweeping the prairies. Even knowing that his son could not fully comprehend, he kept speaking just to hear the soft laughter that rose each time his voice reached the boy's small ears. But the distance between them was not measured in miles. It was an ocean of silence that Miller could never cross. In the pages of notes discovered after his death, one line tore at the reader's heart. There are things a father can never explain. Only that I loved my son, but that love was imprisoned behind locked doors. Arthur Miller carried that wound to the grave, a wound born both of the crushing social stigma of his time and of the sentence he imposed upon himself. It remains there still, a cold emptiness within the legacy of a man once thought to understand the human heart better than anyone else. 10 Patricia Neal, leaving all of Hollywood just to hold her child in her arms. In October 1962, the New York Times suddenly ran a brief notice in its Society column: Oscar-winning actress Patricia Neal suspends all film activities for family reasons. The short line revealed nothing yet. Behind it was a storm of emotions no newspaper could ever fully capture. Olivia Dahl, the daughter of Patricia and writer Roald Dahl, was only 7 years old, the radiant joy of both parents. Just days earlier, Olivia had been skipping happily through Central Park. Then one afternoon, she returned home with a mild fever, and Patricia assumed it was just the flu. But as night fell, Olivia suddenly slipped into confusion. Her words became disjointed, and then she collapsed unconscious. The diagnosis from Lenox Hill Hospital came like a death sentence: encephalitis as a complication of measles, a a rare disease, but one that ravages the brain with ferocity. At the time, Daily News described it as an illness that makes parents hold their breath hour by hour because the chance of survival is vanishingly small. Patricia left the film set immediately. No longer the glamorous star gracing red carpets, she was seen in hospital corridors with disheveled hair, an old sweater, and a cup of cold coffee in hand. A Life magazine reporter recalled once seeing Patricia sit motionless for hours beside her daughter's bed, gently stroking her hair and whispering words no one else could hear. Roald Dahl, instead of writing his usual fairy tales, rooted himself in the hospital, reaching out to leading doctors from New York to London. The Guardian later revealed that he once wrote a desperate letter to a neurologist in England pleading for any method that might help Olivia recover. Time dragged on heavy as years. Each time Olivia opened her eyes, Patricia forced a smile through her tears. When the little girl moved her finger for the first time, Roald immediately called relatives, "She's still here. God has kept her with us." Olivia survived the crisis, but Patricia never forgot the feeling of watching her child lie motionless beneath the cold glare of surgical lights and unfeeling machines. Years later, in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, she admitted with emotion, "The Oscar can sit on a shelf, but the first embrace from Olivia after she woke up was the true prize that life gave me." The battle fought by Patricia and Olivia became one of the most moving stories in Hollywood during the 1960s, proof that sometimes all the glory in the world must bow before a mother's love. And in much the same way, decades later, Toni Braxton, the Grammy-winning singer, would embark on a different but equally fierce journey fighting to pull her son out of the silent world into which autism had locked his childhood. 11 Toni Braxton, the mother who had to wait until her son was 4 years old to hear his first words. In the spring of 2005, People magazine published a series of photos of Toni Braxton dazzling on the red carpet, her glittering gown hugging her figure, and her radiant smile drawing every eye. No one could have imagined that just hours after leaving the spotlight, the singer would be quietly curled up in a small room watching her second son, Diesel Kai Braxton Lewis, sitting silently in a corner, his gaze drifting toward a faraway place that even his mother could not reach. At first, that silence only made Toni a little uneasy. But as the months went by and her son still never called her mom, never smiled, never reacted when she sang lullabies, the unusual stillness grew heavier and heavier on the heart of a woman whose life had always been immersed in music. After many tests, a specialist in Los Angeles delivered the diagnosis autism. "He may never communicate the way other children do," the doctor said, and those words cut into Toni's mind like a blade slashing through every note of music she had ever known. According to the Los Angeles Times, Toni set aside many singing projects at that time to devote all her energy to finding a path for Diesel. She wandered through therapy centers across California, attended endless workshops, and talked with parents whose children were in the same situation. She learned to use picture boards, color cards, short songs, and above all, patient eye contact to slowly dismantle the wall of silence around her son. There were days when Toni would sit for hours facing him, waiting only for a fleeting glance or the faintest movement of his lips. In an interview with Access Hollywood, she said with determination, "I don't care how long it takes. As long as I get one sign from him, I'll keep going." And then the small miracle happened. Diesel spoke for the first time, the words not perfectly clear but distinct enough to make Toni burst into tears. One word turned into two, then into sentences. By 2018, Toni proudly announced that her son could not only communicate well, but had even signed a modeling contract, walking confidently on the runway with a radiant smile, living proof that a mother's love and perseverance can rewrite destiny itself. Looking back, Toni called that period a silent battle and confessed with emotion, "I have lost many things in life, money, fame, opportunities, but I will never lose my son." Tony's story reminded the public of another family who endured an equally grueling journey, Beyonce and Jay-Z, when they had to confront their daughter Blue Ivy's hearing issues from her earliest years. 12. Beyonce and Jay-Z, the journey to reclaim their daughter's angelic voice. In the public eye, they were the embodiment of perfection. Beyonce, the queen of the stage with a powerful voice and unforgettable performances. Jay-Z, a rap legend and towering mogul of the music industry. On the red carpet, they shone so brightly, it seemed nothing could ever touch them. But behind the smiles in front of the cameras, the Carter family once lived through months when neither wealth nor fame could offer comfort. When Blue Ivy turned 4, Beyonce began to notice something wasn't right. The little girl did not turn around when her mother called from close by, and she frowned when hearing sounds with high frequencies. At first, the family assumed it was nothing more than a child's absent-mindedness. But a visit to an audiology clinic in New York ended with words Beyonce would never forget. "Your daughter has a hearing problem. If there is no early intervention, her ability to hear and speak will be permanently affected." That moment felt like her heart fell into an abyss. For Beyonce's sound was not just her career, it was the lifeblood running through her family. The thought of her daughter growing up in a world without music, without applause, left her almost breathless. From that day forward, the couple's routine changed completely. Beyonce put aside many projects, spending hours each day sitting close to her daughter, singing slow, repetitive lines to help Blue Ivy focus on listening and imitating. Jay-Z, despite his international tours, always took her along so that he would not miss a single therapy session. Billboard once wrote that they turned every hotel room into a mini sound studio, where the guitar rhythmic beats and her mother's voice blended with their daughter's laughter. The early months were exhausting and filled with tears. There were sessions when Blue Ivy stayed silent for long stretches, staring out the window. Yet Beyonce remained patient, placing her hand over her daughter's and whispering softly, "I'm here. Listen to me." Gradually, small reactions appeared, a glance toward her mother. When music played, a gentle nod when her name was called. And then finally, the little voice rose, trembling but so beautiful, it made both parents weep. By 2021, at only 9 years old, Blue Ivy stepped onto the stage to accept a Grammy Award, becoming the youngest artist in history to win the honor. Her pure, ringing voice echoing through the hall erased every memory of those fearful days. For Beyonce and Jay-Z, that moment was not just about glory, but proof that love and persistence can bring a voice back from the edge of silence. And this story, in turn, brought to mind another Hollywood father of the past, Lloyd Nolan, who faced a similar pain when raising one of the very first children in America to be diagnosed with autism in an era when the world understood almost nothing about the condition. 13. Lloyd Nolan, the father whose son was among the first autism cases diagnosed in America in the mid-20th century, when in America, people didn't even know how to properly name the condition. Lloyd Nolan was stunned when he was told that his son, Jay Nolan, was among the very first officially diagnosed cases of autism. It was not merely a medical conclusion, but felt like a strange sentence hanging overhead with no one able to explain it and no one knowing what to do about it. At that time, the word autism had only appeared sporadically in a handful of thin research papers. Medicine had yet to discover a cause, society barely understood it, and certainly did not accept it. The Nolan family had no guidebooks, no community of support, no internet to search for answers. Instead, they were met with the cold advice of some doctors. You should send the child to a special facility. There he will be less of a burden on the family. Lloyd, the man who had portrayed dozens of strong, resilient characters on the silver screen, now found himself standing at a cruel crossroads in real life. To follow the advice meant being separated from his son forever. To stay meant stepping into an unknown land where every day would be a new experiment without clear answers. And Lloyd chose to walk into that unknown. That decision completely changed his life. Lloyd turned down film contracts, let go of countless golden opportunities just to remain at home, patiently teaching Jay the smallest skills that came naturally to other children, making eye contact, lifting a spoon to eat, stacking wooden blocks into shapes. On some days, Jay would sit motionless for hours, eyes drifting into a distant void. Lloyd would quietly sit beside him, saying nothing, simply resting his hand gently on his son's shoulder, like a silent vow, "I will always be here. I will never leave you." The moment Jay spoke his very first words, Lloyd felt as though he had just heard the most beautiful music of his life. Not a line of dialogue, not the applause of an audience, but the fragile voice of the son he had once feared he might lose forever. Later newspapers such as the Los Angeles Times would describe him not only as Hollywood's reliable leading man, but also as a steadfast father ahead of his time. But Lloyd did not stop at his own family. In a society that nearly ignored the existence of autistic children, he stepped forward using his voice and his stature to call for attention from both the community and the government. He advocated for the establishment of special education programs, laying some of the very first stones on a path that millions of American families would later walk. When Lloyd Nolan passed away in 1985, friends and the public remembered him, not just through the dozens of films he starred in, but also as an enduring symbol of fatherhood that overcame every barrier. For in a world that was not ready to accept his special son, Lloyd chose to hold him tightly and never once let go. You've just heard the stories behind the glittering lights, where Hollywood legends were not only stars, but also fathers and mothers who endured the deepest pain because of their disabled or ill children. They sacrificed, they stood strong, and they loved their children with all their hearts, regardless of the losses. What about you? What do you think gave them the strength to stand firm against such cruel hardships? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you feel these stories have truly touched your heart, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next videos.